Naruto stood in the midst of Konoha's Hokage office, bloodied and bruised, his clothes torn from the battle. Sasuke Uchiha, equally battered but still alive, lay barely conscious on the ground beside him. The tension in the air was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on Naruto's chest as he clutched Sasuke's body protectively, refusing to let go. The mission had been supposed to be simple: retrieve Sasuke, bring him back to Konoha, and resolve the conflict with Orochimaru. But things had gone horribly wrong. Naruto's body trembled from exhaustion, and every breath he took sent waves of pain through his battered form. He had done everything in his power to bring Sasuke back, but in the end, it had cost him more than he could have ever imagined. Tsunade's eyes were hard as she looked down at the two of them, her gaze lingering on Naruto. The anger, confusion, and disgust were visible in the lines of her face. She had always been protective of Konoha, but this situation was different, far too personal. "You failed, Naruto." Tsunade's voice was cold, detached. "You failed to protect Sasuke, and you failed to protect this village." Naruto's hands clenched into fists. "I did what I had to do. Sasuke, he's still alive. I brought him back, didn't I?" His voice was hoarse, desperation slipping into his words. Jiraiya, standing off to the side, couldn't meet Naruto's eyes. He, too, was conflicted. He had always seen Naruto as the child of prophecy, the one who would change the course of history. But now, standing here, seeing the Uchiha at his mercy, everything felt wrong. The village had already blamed Naruto for too much. It wasn't just the mission to retrieve Sasuke that had caused the tension, it was the culmination of years of resentment. His very existence had become a symbol of fear and hatred for many. Tsunade's eyes hardened. "The village is in turmoil. You, Naruto, are seen as the cause of so much pain: the death of Minato, Kushina, and the terror of the Nine Tails. Everything that went wrong, everything that has happened since, has been tied to your existence." Her voice faltered for a moment as she continued, "You are a reminder of everything Konoha has lost." Naruto winced at her words. They stung. It had been years since he had heard these things, but they still hurt just as deeply. His fists tightened in frustration, his nails digging into his palms. He was a reminder of pain. A reminder of loss. The very thing he had worked so hard to overcome. His heart raced, pumping in time with his anger as he looked at the figures gathered around him: the elders, the council, the villagers who had long since ridden him off. The council meeting had been called, and the decision was swift. Naruto was to be executed. The elders, ever the pragmatists, believed that Sasuke's recovery was more important than Naruto's life. They viewed Naruto's actions as a betrayal, a threat to the village that had raised him. Tsunade, despite her reluctance, had agreed with their assessment. She had to protect the village, even if it meant sacrificing her most trusted ally. Even if it meant sacrificing him. Jiraiya's gaze was heavy. He had fought for Naruto, believed in him, but even he couldn't see a way out of this. The weight of the decision bore down on him like a crushing force. "Naruto." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. What could he say? Naruto, in his exhaustion and pain, could barely register what was happening. He had been betrayed, his life discarded as though it meant nothing. His parents, Minato and Kushina, had given everything to protect the village, and now they were gone. They had left him with nothing but an identity tied to the Nine Tails, a burden he hadn't asked for. Sasuke's hand twitched, and Naruto's heart skipped a beat. He looked down at the Uchiha, eyes narrowing with a mixture of resentment and guilt. Sasuke had been his closest friend, his rival, his companion in arms, but now, Naruto felt the sting of betrayal from him too. Sasuke was the one they all wanted. Sasuke was the one they all would have sacrificed him for. And now, as Naruto watched the Hokage's office fill with figures who could decide his fate, he felt an unshakable anger begin to rise. His stomach churned, and his vision blurred as the weight of the village's condemnation sank in. The elders spoke again, but their words were drowned out by the deafening roar in Naruto's ears. He could feel it, something deep within him stirring. A fire that had been waiting to be unleashed. He had spent his life seeking approval, striving for acceptance, but this was it. They had turned on him. They had branded him a failure. His mind screamed for power, for revenge. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object, the headband that had once symbolized his place in the village. He had been a ninja, a protector, someone who was supposed to uphold the values of Konoha. But what had it brought him? Pain. Loneliness. Betrayal. His grip on the headband tightened until the fabric began to tear. And then, there was a flash of light. A voice. Ancient. Majestic. Commanding. Do you wish for power? Naruto's breath hitched as the voice echoed in his mind. It was so clear, so powerful, that it shook him to his core. He didn't know where it came from, but it felt familiar. A presence that seemed to radiate strength, confidence, and unyielding authority. His heart pounded as the voice continued, "Your birth was no accident. You are not the child of Minato and Kushina. You are the child of something far greater. The blood of kings flows through your veins." Naruto's eyes widened, disbelief clouding his thoughts. The voice was calling to him, beckoning him to embrace something far beyond what he had ever known. Something that could give him the strength to exact revenge on the very village that had turned against him. The voice spoke again, its tone unrelenting. "Claim your birthright, Naruto. Take what is yours. And I will give you the power to make them all bow at your feet." In that instant, the chains of the village's betrayal shattered within him. Naruto's eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light as he stood, his body filled with a new, undeniable power. The chakras swirling inside him began to warp and twist, and with a single thought, he shattered the bonds that held him captive. He turned to face the elders, to face Tsunade and Jiraiya, faces that had once been so familiar, so trusted. But now, they were nothing more than obstacles to his vision. They had chosen Sasuke over him. They had chosen weakness over strength. Enough, Naruto's voice rang out, the words laced with the same power that surged through him. I am no longer a tool for your village. I am no longer your weapon to control. The air in the room crackled with energy as Naruto's presence seemed to warp the very space around him. His chakra, infused with an ancient force, expanded outward. The room seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Tsunade took a step back, her eyes wide in disbelief, while the elders watched with a mixture of fear and awe. Your village betrayed me. You betrayed me. And now, you will pay for it? Naruto's gaze turned toward Sasuke, still unconscious on the ground. His heart ached for the Uchiha, his once rival, his friend. But that was a different time. Sasuke had chosen his path. And now, it was time for Naruto to choose his own. He lifted his hand, and in an instant, Sasuke was enveloped in a sphere of energy, suspended in mid-air. The Uchiha's body convulsed violently as Naruto began to drain the life force from him, slowly but surely. This was the beginning. This was the first step in his journey to claim his birthright. His powers continued to swell, the voice in his mind urging him forward. Destroy them all, Naruto. Make them regret their choice. Naruto's heart beat faster as he felt his own soul intertwining with the ancient power that surged within him. His body was no longer his own. It was a vessel for something far older, far more powerful. And with that, the gates of Konoha had trembled. The era of Naruto Uzumaki had come to an end. The era of Naruto, the son of Gilgamesh, was about to begin. The heart of Konoha was alive with a cruel, vibrant energy. Villagers crowded the square, their voices a chaotic symphony of jeers and curses. Children clung to their parents' hands, their wide eyes fixed on the raised platform in the center, where a boy stood alone. Naruto Uzumaki, the pariah of Konoha, stood motionless, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His head hung low, the mop of blonde hair disheveled and dirted, but his cerulean eyes, though dim, still burned faintly with something unyielding. The sky above was gray, clouds thick and oppressive, threatening rain. It felt fitting for the occasion, somber, heavy, final. The air was thick with anticipation, and the crowd seemed to lean forward as one, hungry to see justice served, or so they claimed. Naruto's body was battered, his injuries from the mission to retrieve Sasuke barely tended to. His orange jumpsuit hung in tatters, stained with blood and dirt. He stood exposed to the cold judgment of the village, a boy who had sacrificed everything for the people who now spat at him. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as his legs threatened to give out beneath him. At the edge of the platform stood Sasuke Uchiha. His face was an emotionless mask, but his eyes betrayed him. There was conflict there, buried beneath his usual arrogance and coldness. The Chidori crackled in his hand, its electric blue light illuminating the darkness creeping over the village square. He was the executioner chosen by Konoha's council, a symbol of the village's supremacy and an appeasement to the Uchiha clan. Naruto lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Sasuke's. There was no hatred there, no plea for mercy. Instead, there was pain, raw, unfiltered pain that reached out and grabbed Sasuke's chest, squeezing until he could barely breathe. "Do it," Naruto whispered, his voice hoarse. His lips barely moved, but Sasuke heard the words clearly, as though they were spoken directly into his mind. The crowd erupted into another wave of shouts and cries. "End him. Demon. Kill the monster already." The words were daggers in Naruto's back, sharper than any blade. For years, he had fought for these people, for their approval. He had smiled through their hatred, laughed through their scorn, and yet here he stood, moments away from death at their hands. His fists clenched weakly at his sides, the chains around his wrists rattling with the effort. He searched the crowd, his heart sinking as he saw familiar faces among the sea of hatred. Sakura stood near the front, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Shikamaru, Ino, Koji, and even Hinata, all of them avoided his eyes, their faces pale and unreadable. Jiraiya was nowhere to be seen. Tsunade stood on the platform's edge, her face a mask of stone, but her hands trembled at her sides. Kakashi, too, was absent. It seemed fitting somehow, in his final moments, the people he had looked up to, trusted, had abandoned him. Naruto turned his attention back to Sasuke, his eyes narrowing. "You always wanted to beat me, right?" he rasped, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, here's your chance. You win, Sasuke. You win." Sasuke flinched, the Chidori faltering for a brief second before reigniting. He didn't respond, but the conflict in his eyes deepened. He had told himself this was for the village, for the greater good. But as he stood there, staring into Naruto's eyes, he wondered if this was really justice or just another crime added to the village's long history of sins. "Do it," someone from the crowd screamed, and others joined in, their voices a cacophony of hate. Naruto closed his eyes, the noise fading into the background. In the darkness of his mind, he saw flashes of his life, Irika's smile as he treated him to ramen, the way Kakashi had ruffled his hair after their first mission, Team 7's camaraderie before everything fell apart. He thought of Jiraiya, the old pervert who had believed in him, and of Tsunade, who had once looked at him with something resembling pride. And then he thought of his parents Minato and Kushina, the people he had never known but had always hoped to make proud. Were they watching now? Would they forgive him for what he had become? The memories dissolved, replaced by a growing darkness. It seeped into every corner of his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a shroud. Anger bubbled to the surface, anger at the villagers, at Sasuke, At Konoha, but most of all, at himself. He had been a fool to think he could ever belong here, to believe that he could ever be anything more than a vessel for their hatred. Naruto opened his eyes, and for a moment, the crowd fell silent. There was something in his gaze, something that made even the most fervent of his detractors hesitate. It was not fear, not resignation, but a quiet, burning fury, a promise that this was not the end. "Sasuke," he said, his voice steady now, stronger. "Do it." Sasuke stepped forward, his chidori crackling with renewed intensity. He raised his hand, the light from the technique casting eerie shadows across both their faces. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of the betrayal he was about to commit. Naruto's lips curled into a faint smile, his head tilting slightly. "Don't hold back." Sasuke hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then he drove the chidori forward. The world seemed to slow as the lightning-infused hand pierced Naruto's chest. Pain exploded in his body, a searing heat that spread outward from the point of impact. His eyes widened, his mouth opening in a silent scream as blood spilled from his lips. The crowd erupted into cheers, their cries of triumph echoing through the square. But Naruto barely heard them. His vision blurred, the edges of his world darkening as the life drained from his body. He staggered, his knees buckling, and Sasuke caught him instinctively, lowering him to the ground. Naruto's breathing was ragged, his blood pooling beneath him. His eyes, half-lidded, met Sasuke's once more. "You really did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no malice in his tone, only a sad, weary acceptance. "I guess. I was never meant to be anything more than this." Sasuke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He could feel Naruto's heartbeat slowing beneath his hand, the warmth of his blood cooling rapidly. Darkness closed in around Naruto, but in his final moments, he felt something stir deep within him, a presence, ancient and powerful, that seemed to reach out and envelop him in its embrace. A voice echoed in the depths of his mind, rich and commanding. "Do not despair, my son. This is but the beginning." Naruto's eyes fluttered shut, the voice wrapping around him like a lifeline. His final thought was not of defeat, but of vengeance, a burning desire to make them all pay for what they had done. As his body went still, the storm clouds overhead broke, and rain began to fall, washing away the blood and tears of Konoha. But for Naruto Uzumaki, the storm was only just beginning. Naruto's first sensation was nothingness. There was no pain, no warmth, no cold, just an empty void that seemed to stretch forever. He floated in the darkness, weightless, his mind barely clinging to awareness. The memories of his final moments in Konoha flashed before him in broken fragments: Sasuke's chidori, the jeering crowd, the blood pooling beneath him. Anger surged within him, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming emptiness. Then, a flicker of light pierced the void. Naruto turned toward it, or perhaps the light turned toward him, and slowly, the darkness receded. The world around him began to take form, though it was unlike anything he had ever seen. He stood in a vast, ethereal plain, the ground beneath his feet shimmering like liquid gold. The sky above was a swirling canvas of crimson and black, dotted with stars that burned brighter than any he had seen in life. "Where am I?" Naruto muttered, his voice echoing in the vastness. "You stand at the precipice of eternity," a deep, resonant voice answered. Naruto turned sharply, his eyes widening as he saw the source of the voice. Before him loomed a massive figure, cloaked in shadows and adorned with flowing robes that seemed to move as if alive. Its face was obscured, save for two piercing red eyes that glowed like embers. This was no ordinary being, it radiated power, an ancient and overwhelming presence that made Naruto's knees weaken. "Who are you?" Naruto asked, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound defiant. "I am the Shinigami," the figure replied, its voice carrying a weight that seemed to shake the very air. "Guardian of life and death, arbiter of souls." "And you, Naruto Uzumaki, have crossed into my domain. Naruto's fists clenched at his sides, his anger beginning to override his fear. So, what now? You gonna judge me or something? Maybe send me to hell for being a demon, just like they always said. The Shinigami tilted its head, a low rumble of amusement emanating from its form. Foolish boy. You are no demon, though you have endured their hatred as if you were. No, your death was not the end. It was merely the beginning. Before Naruto could respond, the golden plane began to shift. A new figure emerged from the light, walking toward them with an air of majesty. His golden hair glowed like sunlight, his crimson eyes piercing yet regal. He was adorned in armor that shone with an otherworldly brilliance, every step commanding attention. Naruto's breath hitched as the man stopped a few paces away, his gaze fixed firmly on him. There was something familiar about him, though Naruto couldn't place it. Who the hell are you? Naruto asked, narrowing his eyes. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. Naruto, he said, his voice calm yet filled with authority. I am Gilgamesh, king of heroes. And more importantly, I am your father. Naruto stared at him, his mind reeling. What? That's impossible. My father was Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage. Everyone knows that. Gilgamesh's smile faded, replaced by a solemn expression. Minato Namikaze was but a name, a role I adopted when I chose to walk among mortals. I left behind my true identity, my throne, and my treasures to experience the world as one of you. In doing so, I met your mother, Kushina Uzumaki, and for the first time in my eternal existence, I knew love. Naruto's head spun as he processed the words. He wanted to deny it, to call the man a liar, but deep down, something resonated within him. The golden hair, the piercing eyes, the commanding presence, it all felt too familiar. Gilgamesh stepped closer, placing a hand on Naruto's shoulder. You are my blood, Naruto. My legacy. And yet, those ungrateful wretches of Konoha cast you aside, spitting on everything you could have been. Naruto flinched at the words, his anger bubbling to the surface. Yeah, well, what does it matter now? They killed me. It's over. No, Gilgamesh said firmly, his eyes blazing. It is far from over. Your death was necessary to awaken your true potential, to break the chains that bound you to their pathetic ideals. Now, you stand at a crossroads. I offer you a chance to claim your heritage, to wield the power that is your birthright. Naruto hesitated, his mind racing. Why now? Why not before all of this? Before they betrayed me. Gilgamesh's expression softened. Because you had to see the truth for yourself. You had to feel the weight of their betrayal, to understand the depths of their hypocrisy. Only then could you rise above it and become what you were always meant to be. Naruto looked down at his hands, the faint scars and calluses from years of training still visible. The memories of his life in Konoha flashed before him: Irika's kindness, his bond with Teen 7, his dreams of becoming Hokage. But those memories were overshadowed by the pain, the hatred, the loneliness that had defined his existence. And what if I don't want it? Naruto asked, his voice quiet. Gilgamesh's eyes narrowed. Then you will fade into obscurity, another forgotten soul lost to the annals of history. But if you accept, you will wield power beyond comprehension. You will become a god among men, capable of reshaping the world itself. Naruto's fists clenched, his anger boiling over. The faces of the villagers, their jeers and insults, Sasuke's cold gaze as he delivered the final blow, it all came rushing back. He thought of his parents, the sacrifices they had made, only for their legacy to be tarnished by a village that didn't deserve it. Fine, Naruto said, his voice firm. If it means I can make them pay, if it means I can make them all see what they've done, then I'll do it. I'll take your power. Gilgamesh smiled, a proud and almost predatory glint in his eyes. Good. Then let us begin. The Shinigami stepped forward, raising its hand. So it is decided? The pact is sealed. A surge of energy engulfed Naruto, his body trembling as the golden light consumed him. His mind was flooded with knowledge, memories of a time long past, of treasures beyond imagination, of battles that shook the heavens, of a kingdom that spanned eternity. He felt his body change, his very essence transforming as he embraced his true self. When the light faded, Naruto stood taller, his presence radiating an aura of raw power. His eyes gleamed with the golden light, and in his hand materialized a weapon, the Sword of Rupture, a weapon of unimaginable power that pulsed with the energy of creation and destruction. Gilgamesh stepped back, his smile widening. Welcome, my son, to your destiny. Naruto looked at his reflection in the shimmering ground, his old self gone. He was no longer the boy Konoha had cast aside. He was something greater, something unstoppable. I'll destroy them, Naruto said, his voice cold and resolute. Konoha, the council, everyone who turned their back on me. I'll tear it all down and rebuild it in my image. Gilgamesh placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression one of approval. Then go, my son. Claim what is rightfully yours. Show them the wrath of a god. And with that, Naruto stepped forward, the golden light surrounding him intensifying as he prepared to return to the world of the living. But this time, he would not return as a victim. He would return as a force of vengeance, a king ready to reclaim his throne. The golden expanse of the divine realm stretched endlessly before him, shimmering with a radiance that seemed to defy the natural order. The air was thick with a palpable energy, humming with power that resonated deep within Naruto's very being. He stood in the center of the ethereal plane, his newly awakened form pulsing with raw strength, yet his mind was still grappling with the enormity of what had happened. Gilgamesh stood a few paces away, his regal form commanding the space effortlessly. His golden armor glinted in the soft, otherworldly light, and his crimson eyes bore into Naruto's with a mix of approval and expectation. You've taken your first steps toward greatness, Gilgamesh said, his voice resonant and calm. But power without mastery is nothing more than chaos. If you are to wield your heritage, you must learn to command it as a king commands his army. Naruto's fists clenched, the rage within him simmering just beneath the surface. The faces of those who had betrayed him, the villagers, the elders, even Sasuke, flashed in his mind. He wanted nothing more than to return and make them pay. But a part of him knew that Gilgamesh was right. If he was going to exact his vengeance, he needed control. He needed to be unstoppable. Then teach me, Naruto said, his voice steady but filled with determination. Teach me everything. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Gilgamesh's lips. Very well. Prepare yourself, for the path ahead will not be easy. But if you succeed, no force in this world or any other will stand against you. With a flick of his wrist, Gilgamesh summoned a portal that shimmered with golden light. Through it spilled an array of weapons, their forms ranging from ornate swords and spears to strange, otherworldly artifacts. Each item radiated an aura of immense power, their presence filling the air with an overwhelming energy. This is the gate of Babylon, Gilgamesh said, gesturing to the arsenal. A treasury containing the wealth of all creation, the original forms of every noble weapon and artifact that has ever existed. As my son, this treasury is your birthright. But it is not simply a collection to admire, it is an extension of your will. To master it, you must understand the nature of a king. Naruto's eyes widened as he stared at the weapons. Each one seemed to call out to him, their power resonating with his own. But there were so many, and the sheer magnitude of the collection was overwhelming. How do I use them? Naruto asked, his gaze flicking between the weapons and Gilgamesh. A king does not ask how, Gilgamesh replied, his tone sharp. A king commands. These treasures are yours, but they will not obey a hesitant hand. Reach out and claim them with the authority that is your birthright. Naruto hesitated for only a moment before extending his hand toward the shimmering portal. As he focused, one of the weapons, a sleek, crimson spear, emerged from the gate and hovered before him. He grasped it firmly, feeling its weight and power as though it were an extension of his own body. "Good," Gilgamesh said, nodding. "But this is only the beginning. The Gate of Babylon is not merely a storehouse, it is a weapon in its own right. You must learn to wield it as effortlessly as breathing." For hours, perhaps even days, time seemed to flow differently in the divine realm. Gilgamesh guided Naruto through the intricacies of the Gate of Babylon. He taught him how to summon multiple weapons at once, how to launch them with precision and devastating force, and how to call upon specific treasures with a mere thought. Naruto's progress was staggering, his synchronization with the gate improving rapidly with each passing moment. But Gilgamesh's training was not limited to combat. Between their grueling sessions, he imparted lessons on leadership, strategy, and the philosophy of kingship. He spoke of the burden and responsibility of wielding absolute power, of the necessity of commanding respect through strength and presence. A king does not grovel, nor does he seek validation, Gilgamesh said during one of their breaks. A king stands above all, his will absolute. If you wish to reshape the world, you must first believe in your own supremacy. Naruto absorbed every word, his hatred for Konoha fueling his determination. The memories of his past, the loneliness, the betrayal, the ridicule burned within him, driving him to push past his limits. He trained relentlessly, his body and mind adapting to the immense power coursing through him. The divine energy of the realm seemed to amplify his growth, and before long, he achieved a near-perfect synchronization with the Gate of Babylon. Yet, despite his rapid progress, Gilgamesh was unrelenting. One day, he summoned a weapon unlike any other, the Sword of Rupture. Its form was otherworldly, its blade a spiraling mass of red and black energy that seemed to twist the very fabric of reality around it. "This," Gilgamesh said, holding the weapon reverently, "is the pinnacle of my treasury. It is a weapon that transcends all others, capable of tearing apart the very foundation of existence. And now, it is yours." Naruto stared at the weapon, awestruck. He could feel its power even from a distance, a force so immense that it seemed to dwarf everything else in the Gate of Babylon. "Take it," Gilgamesh commanded, holding the weapon out to him. "But know this, does not suffer the weak. To wield it, you must prove that you are worthy." Naruto stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the weapon. The moment his fingers brushed against its surface, a surge of energy coursed through him, overwhelming and almost unbearable. His mind was flooded with visions of destruction, of worlds torn asunder by Ye's power. But he did not falter. Gritting his teeth, he tightened his grip on the weapon, forcing himself to endure the torrent of energy. Slowly, the overwhelming force began to subside, and he felt the weapon's power align with his own. Gilgamesh's eyes gleamed with pride. "You have done well, my son. You are now ready." Naruto looked down at the weapon's spiraling energy reflecting in his golden eyes. He could feel its immense power, its potential for destruction. And for the first time, he felt truly unstoppable. "I'll use this," Naruto said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll use all of it to destroy Konoha, to make them pay for everything they've done." Gilgamesh placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and approval. "Then go, my son. Show them the wrath of a king. Show them the power of the son of Gilgamesh." With a final nod, Naruto stepped forward, the golden light of the divine realm enveloping him. His training was complete, and his path was clear. He would return to the world of the living not as the outcast they had scorned, but as a force of vengeance and power. The air in the elemental nations was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the warm, radiant aura that now surrounded Naruto. He stood on the edge of a dense forest, his golden hair glinting in the sunlight, his eyes glowing with the same regal hue that marked his divine lineage. The power coursing through his veins was intoxicating, a perfect blend of chakra and divine energy that made him feel untouchable. He took a deep breath, the sense of the world sharper and more vivid than ever before. Every sound, every movement of the wind, felt amplified. His senses were heightened to an extraordinary degree, and he could feel the world bending subtly to his will. This was not the world he had left behind. He was not the same person who had been betrayed and cast aside. He was Naruto Uzumaki no longer. He was the son of Gilgamesh, the rightful king reborn. Naruto stepped forward, his bare feet crunching against the frost-laden grass. Ahead of him, a small bandit camp sprawled across a clearing. It was a pathetic sight, crudely constructed tents, a meager fire sputtering in the center, and a handful of rough-looking men lounging about. They laughed and drank, oblivious to the presence of the golden figure who now stood at the edge of their territory. Naruto's lips curled into a faint smirk. These men were nothing more than insects to him, but they would serve a purpose. He needed to test his newfound powers, to see the extent of what he was capable of. He raised his hand, and with a mere thought, the gate of Babylon materialized behind him. The golden portal shimmered into existence, its presence overwhelming and majestic. From within, countless weapons emerged, their edges gleaming with an otherworldly light. The bandits noticed him then, their drunken laughter dying out as they turned to stare. One of them, a burly man with a jagged scar across his face, stood up and grabbed the rusted sword from the ground. "Who the hell are you?" the man barked, his voice rough and slurred. "This is our territory. Get lost, or we'll..." Naruto didn't let him finish. With a flick of his wrist, the gleaming spear shot out from the gate of Babylon and impaled the man through the chest. The bandit's eyes widened in shock before he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The remaining bandits scrambled to their feet, panic etched across their faces. They grabbed their weapons and charged at Naruto, shouting incoherent threats. But Naruto didn't move. He didn't need to. With another thought, the weapons within the gate of Babylon rained down upon the bandits. Swords, spears, and axes pierced through the air with precision, striking their targets with deadly accuracy. The men didn't stand a chance. Within moments, the clearing was silent, the ground littered with bodies and blood. Naruto walked forward, stepping over the corpses without a second glance. He stood in the center of the camp, surveying the destruction he had wrought. It had been effortless, almost too easy. But it was a start. The fire crackled weakly, and Naruto knelt beside it, his golden eyes reflecting the flames. He reached out, grabbing a small wooden bowl that one of the bandits had been using. It was filled with a crude stew, its smell pungent and unappetizing. Naruto sniffed it and wrinkled his nose before tossing it aside. "Pathetic," he muttered. "Is this all this world has to offer?" He stood up and turned his gaze to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Konoha still stood, the village that had betrayed him, the people who had cast him aside. They were living their lives, oblivious to the storm that was now heading their way. Naruto's hand tightened into a fist, and the gate of Babylon shimmered behind him once more. A single weapon emerged, the sword of rupture. Its spiraling energy pulsed with a power that felt alive, almost sentient. "Soon," Naruto said, his voice low and filled with promise. "They will know what it means to betray a king." He sheathed the Ie within the gate and began to walk. The news of his actions would spread, he knew. Fear and curiosity would ripple through the nations as tales of a golden warrior obliterating a bandit camp reached the ears of those in power. And that was exactly what he wanted. Let them tremble. Let them wonder. He would give them time to prepare, to gather their forces, to convince themselves that they could stand against him. It would make their eventual defeat all the more satisfying. The journey through the forest was uneventful, but Naruto didn't mind. His thoughts were consumed by memories of his training with Gilgamesh, of the lessons he had learned. His father's words echoed in his mind. A king does not simply destroy. A king reshapes the world in his image. But to do so, he must first command respect, through strength and presence. Naruto stopped at the edge of the forest, his gaze sweeping over the landscape before him. A small village lay in the distance, its wooden houses clustered together like insects huddling for warmth. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind. He would start there. Not with destruction, but with domination. He would make them kneel, make them understand that he was not a man to be trifled with. Naruto's golden aura flared as he stepped out of the shadows, his figure illuminated by the setting sun. The villagers would see him coming, and they would feel the weight of his presence long before he arrived. This was only the beginning. The elemental nations had no idea what was coming for them. But soon, they would learn. They would learn what it meant to face the son of Gilgamesh. The morning was cold, the air heavy with mist as Naruto stood on the outskirts of a small shinobi village hidden within a dense forest. He observed the village quietly, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It was quaint simple homes with thatched roofs, narrow dirt paths, and a handful of shinobi patrolling the perimeter. The village's flag fluttered weakly in the breeze, a symbol of their pride that would soon mean nothing. Naruto tilted his head, assessing the scene before him. The village was insignificant in the grand scheme of things, a mere speck in the elemental nations. But it would serve as the perfect starting point for his campaign. He would test their strength, break their will, and leave a message for anyone foolish enough to oppose him. The gate of Babylon shimmered into existence behind him, its golden glow cutting through the mist. Weapons hovered within the gate, their edges gleaming, ready to strike at his command. He raised a hand, and a single sword shot out, embedding itself in the ground near the village's entrance with a deafening thud. The sound echoed through the stillness, drawing the attention of the shinobi on patrol. "Who goes there?" one of them called out, his voice tinged with unease. Naruto stepped forward, his figure emerging from the shadows like a god descending from the heavens. His golden aura radiated power, and his presence alone was enough to make the shinobi hesitate. They exchanged nervous glances, their hands twitching toward their weapons. "I am your king," Naruto said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Kneel, and I will spare your lives." The shinobi froze, stunned by the audacity of his words. One of them, a young man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his kunai drawn. "Who do you think you are? This is our village. We don't bow to anyone." Naruto's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Then you've chosen death." Before the shinobi could react, Naruto raised his hand, and the gate of Babylon responded. A barrage of weapons shot out, their speed and precision unmatched. The young man barely had time to register what was happening before he was struck down, his body collapsing in a heap. The remaining shinobi scrambled to defend themselves, but it was futile. Naruto moved with an otherworldly grace, his attacks calculated and merciless. Within moments, the perimeter guards lay defeated, their blood staining the ground. The commotion had drawn the attention of the villagers, who now gathered in the square, their faces pale with fear. Naruto approached them, his golden aura casting an ethereal glow over the crowd. He could feel their terror, their confusion, and he relished it. "Listen well," Naruto said, his voice carrying over the hushed whispers of the crowd. "Your village is mine now. Resist, and you will suffer the same fate as your shinobi." An older man, likely the village leader, stepped forward, his hands trembling. What do you want from us?" Naruto's gaze bore into the man, silencing him with its intensity. "Loyalty," he said simply. "Swear fealty to me, and I will grant you prosperity. Defy me, and I will erase your village from existence." The villagers exchanged fearful glances, their whispers growing louder. The older man hesitated, his eyes darting to the bodies of the fallen shinobi. Finally, He dropped to his knees, his head bowed low. We swear fealty to you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naruto's smirk deepened. Good. You've made the right choice. He turned to the villagers, his gaze sweeping over them. You will serve me faithfully. Disobedience will not be tolerated. Spread word of your new king. Let the world know that resistance is futile. With that, Naruto summoned a massive golden banner from the gate of Babylon, its design intricate and regal. He planted it in the center of the village square, marking the village as his territory. The villagers watched in awe and fear as the banner shimmered with an otherworldly light. Naruto lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on the terrified faces before him. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the village behind. He didn't need to stay, his message had been delivered, and his dominance established. Word of the Golden Warrior spread quickly, reaching nearby villages and eventually the larger shinobi nations. Tales of his overwhelming power and charisma fueled fear and curiosity. Leaders whispered of a new threat, a force unlike anything they had faced before. In Konoha, Tsunade sat in her office, a stack of reports spread out before her. Each one described the same figure, a golden-haired warrior with unparalleled power, subjugating villages with ease. She frowned, her mind racing as she pieced together the information. Could it be? She murmured, her thoughts trailing off. Beside her, Jiraiya leaned against the wall, his expression grim. It's too soon to jump to conclusions, he said. But if it's who we think it is, we're in trouble. Tsunade nodded, her hand clenching into a fist. We need more information. Send out scouts. I want to know who this golden warrior really is and what he wants. As the village elders debated their next move, Naruto continued his conquest, targeting one village after another. Each victory was swift and decisive, his power unmatched. He left a trail of fear in his wake, his name whispered in hushed tones across the nations. But Naruto's identity remained a mystery to all. For now, Naruto stood at the edge of a windswept cliff, overlooking the dense forest that stretched endlessly before him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver light over the landscape. His golden cloak billowed in the cold breeze, the glow of his gate of Babylon faintly illuminating the darkness behind him. He could sense them approaching like shadows creeping closer. The Akatsuki had come. He didn't need to turn to know they were there. Their distinct chakras, like smoldering embers, radiated power and malice. Slowly, the figures emerged from the trees, stepping into the moonlight one by one. It was an intimidating sight for anyone who didn't wield the power of a god. Quite the presence, Kisame Hoshigaki remarked, resting his massive sword, same hata, on his shoulder. His shark-like grin widened as his small, predatory eyes fixed on Naruto. You're the one everyone's been talking about, huh? The Golden Warrior. Naruto didn't respond. His golden eyes locked onto them, unmoving and unbothered, as if they were beneath his notice. Rude, Haiden spat, twirling his side lazily. I was expecting some self-proclaimed god to at least make a speech or something. What's the matter, Blondie? Got nothing to say. Payne, standing at the center of the group, raised a hand, silencing the chatter. His Rinnegan eyes bore into Naruto, attempting to gauge the enigma before him. You've caused quite a stir, Payne said. His voice was calm but carried an underlying intensity. Your power disrupts the balance of this world. We cannot ignore your existence. Naruto tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Balance, he echoed, his voice smooth and steady. You speak of balance while you seek to plunge the world into chaos. Hypocrisy doesn't suit you. Payne's expression didn't falter, but the slightest flicker of annoyance crossed his features. Our goal is peace. True peace, achieved through understanding and pain. Join us, and your strength will help reshape this world. Naruto's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was devoid of warmth. Peace achieved through suffering? You delude yourselves. You're nothing more than children playing with ideals you can't comprehend. Kakuzu, silent until now, stepped forward, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the tension. He's arrogant. That arrogance will cost him. Naruto chuckled softly, the sound low and mocking. Arrogance? Perhaps. But you'll see soon enough that it's well earned. Hayden couldn't contain himself any longer. Enough of this crap, he shouted, lunging forward with his scythe raised. Let's see how your god complex holds up against Jashin. Naruto didn't move as Hayden charged at him, his scythe slicing through the air with deadly precision. At the last moment, a golden sword materialized from the gate of Babylon and shot forward with blinding speed. It struck Hayden mid-charge, piercing through his chest and pinning him to the ground. Hayden screamed, thrashing against the weapon. You bastard! That's not gonna kill me. Naruto stepped closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. Kill you? No. But it will silence your noise. With a flick of his wrist, another sword shot out, severing Hayden's head cleanly from his body. The remaining Akatsuki members tensed, their casual demeanor replaced with sharp focus. Kisame's grin widened, though it no longer held amusement. Well, this just got interesting. Without hesitation, Kisame swung Samehada, releasing a massive wave of chakra that surged toward Naruto like a tidal wave. Naruto raised a hand, and a shimmering golden shield emerged from the gate of Babylon, absorbing the attack effortlessly. Before Kisame could react, Naruto retaliated. A barrage of weapons erupted from the gate, each one glowing with destructive energy. Kisame barely managed to deflect a few with Samehada before being overwhelmed. One blade grazed his shoulder, the force of it sending him skidding backward. Deidara, perched on a clay bird high above, took advantage of the chaos. Let's see how you handle art. Yeah, he sneered, tossing a handful of explosive clay down toward Naruto. The explosions lit up the night sky, shaking the ground with their intensity. For a moment, the battlefield was shrouded in smoke. But when the dust cleared, Naruto stood unharmed, his golden aura pulsing stronger than ever. Is that the extent of your art? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Deidara's eye twitched, frustration evident. You cocky bastard. Payne finally stepped forward, raising a hand as the other members prepared to launch their next attacks. Enough, he commanded. His eyes met Naruto's once more. You've made your choice. If you will not join us, then you leave us no choice but to eliminate you. Naruto's smirk widened, his confidence unwavering. You think you can eliminate me? You overestimate yourselves. Payne's expression hardened. We'll see. The battle that followed was unlike anything the elemental nations had ever seen. Naruto moved like a god among mortals, each swing of his weapons precise and devastating. The gate of Babylon unleashed a torrent of destruction, forcing the Akatsuki members to fight with everything they had just to stay alive. Naruto spared no effort in showcasing his superiority. He blocked Payne's Shinra Tensei with ease, countered Kisame's water-based techniques with golden spears that turned the very water against him, and outmaneuvered Kakuzu's elemental assaults with speed that seemed impossible. By the end of the fight, the battlefield was unrecognizable, scarred and broken from the sheer magnitude of the power unleashed. Only Payne remained standing, his breaths ragged, his body battered. Naruto towered over him, his golden eyes glowing with an intensity that made the leader of the Akatsuki falter for the first time. I told you, Naruto said, his voice calm but laced with finality. Your ideals mean nothing to me. Tell your comrades, your followers, your entire organization, I am the true king of these lands. I do not bow, and I do not kneel. If you stand in my way again, I will erase you from existence. Payne said nothing, his Rinnegan eyes narrowing as he considered his options. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Naruto alone amidst the wreckage. As the winds carried away the dust and debris, Naruto stood tall, his golden cloak shimmering in the moonlight. His declaration had been made, and the message was clear: he was a force to be reckoned with, a god among men. The Akatsuki would not forget this day. Nor would the elemental nations. The morning sun rose over Konoha, painting the once proud village in hues of orange and red. Birds chirped faintly, but their songs did little to pierce the heavy tension that gripped the air. Shinobi gathered in hushed groups, whispers bouncing off every corner like echoes of a curse. The news had arrived overnight, terrifying, unbelievable, and yet undeniable. The Golden Warrior, the godlike conqueror spreading chaos across the elemental nations, was none other than Naruto Uzumaki. Tsunade stood in her office, her trembling hands gripping a scroll tightly. The message bore the mark of a shinobi scout who had barely escaped from the border of a village Naruto had reduced to dust. Her ember eyes stared at the words as if reading them again would change their meaning. "He's alive," she whispered to herself, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. Her hand dropped the scroll onto the desk as her gaze lifted to the framed picture of Teen 7, the young Naruto, grinning like a fool with that same innocence she now realized they had taken for granted. The corners of her eyes burned, her heart constricting with the kind of guilt that gnawed from the inside out. Jiraiya sat in the chair across from her, unusually quiet. The Toad Sage's typical boisterous demeanor had vanished, replaced by a hollow silence. He rubbed the hand across his face, groaning softly as though the weight of his thoughts was too much to bear. "I should have seen it," Jiraiya muttered, his voice gravelly. "I should have been there for him, instead of chasing after prophecies and shadows." Tsunade slammed her fist onto the desk, making the wood creak under the force. "We failed him, Jiraiya." Her voice cracked, and she didn't care. "We turned our backs on that boy, dismissed him like he was nothing," and now she stopped herself as her voice dropped to a whisper. "Now we've created something we can't control." A chilling silence hung between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the village waking up. They both knew it. This wasn't just a rogue ninja or an S-ranked criminal like Orochimaru. This was Naruto reborn, changed, and now wielding power far beyond what anyone in Konoha could match. He wasn't just another threat, he was a storm that would swallow the world whole if they didn't act. "Tsunade," Jiraiya began cautiously. "We need to prepare. If he comes here, he will." Tsunade's tone was resigned, yet resolute. "This is where it all started. If he's declared war on the shinobi world, Konoha will be at the center of his wrath." Jiraiya ran a hand through his white hair, his expression heavy. "He won't forgive us." "Would you?" she asked bitterly, though the question was rhetorical. Elsewhere in the village, Sasuke Uchiha stared blankly at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, the lines under his dark eyes more pronounced than usual. It had been hours since the Hokage summons, and still, his mind reeled from the truth he'd been told. Naruto was alive. The very same Naruto whose blood had stained his hands. He could still remember it with perfect clarity, the way the Chidori pierced Naruto's chest, the faint gasp of breath that followed, and the way his body had fallen limp. Back then, he had told himself it was what needed to be done. That it was for the village. For peace. But now, as he looked at himself, all he could see was the reflection of a coward who had betrayed someone who once called him a friend. "Damn it," Sasuke muttered under his breath, punching the wall so hard the wood cracked beneath his fist. It wasn't just guilt that plagued him, it was fear. The reports of Naruto's destruction were spreading like wildfire. Villages had fallen. Leaders had submitted. This wasn't the same boy who used to chase him through the forests or boast about becoming Hokage. Naruto had returned as something greater. Something unstoppable. Sasuke had been summoned to lead the effort to confront him, the executioner who'd sent Naruto to his death. Did Tsunade expect him to stand a chance against that power? Or perhaps she intended for him to atone through failure. Either way, Sasuke knew he wouldn't come back unscathed. "You'll face him again," a voice murmured from the shadows of his room. Sasuke turned sharply, his Sharingan activating instinctively, but it was only Kakashi, his former sensei, leaning against the window sill. His visible eye was calm, yet there was a sadness in it that Sasuke couldn't ignore. "Sensei," Sasuke said quietly, his Sharingan fading. Kakashi stepped into the room, the air between them heavy with unspoken understanding. "Tsunade-sama gave you the mission, didn't she?" "Yes." Kakashi nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the cracked wall where Sasuke's fist had landed. "This isn't going to be easy for you." "I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Kakashi finally sat down on the edge of the bed, his voice softer when he spoke again. "Naruto trusted you, Sasuke. He chased after you, fought for you, even when everyone else turned their back on him." Sasuke flinched slightly but said nothing. "And you?" Kakashi sighed, choosing his words carefully. "You were the one who struck the final blow. If anyone should face him now, it's you." Sasuke turned back to the mirror, his jaw clenching tightly. He didn't need to be reminded. He didn't need anyone to tell him how deeply he had wronged Naruto. But hearing it from Kakashi, someone who had been like a father figure to all of them, made the reality cut even deeper. "Do you think he'll kill me?" Sasuke asked quietly, not out of fear, but out of genuine curiosity. Kakashi didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. But I do know that he's not the same Naruto we knew. He's someone else now. Someone who sees us as his enemy." Sasuke closed his eyes, gripping the edges of the sink to steady himself. "I'll face him," he said at last, though his voice lacked the confidence he used to wield so effortlessly. "If it's the only way to end this, I'll do it." Kakashi's eye softened slightly, though he said nothing more. In a world where choices had already been made and mistakes carved into the very bones of history, there were no easy answers left. Days later, the village of Konoha buzzed with frantic preparation. Shinobi trained relentlessly, patrols grew tighter, and fortifications were reinforced. Yet despite their efforts, a palpable sense of dread loomed over everyone. The villagers murmured among themselves, some in fear, others in anger. "It's him, isn't it? The demon boy, he's back. He's going to destroy us all." Every word cut deeper into Tsunade's resolve as she watched her people from the window of her office. The reports were clearer now. Naruto's forces were growing. The small villages he had subjugated swore loyalty to him, their leaders bending the knee to the Golden King. His influence spread like wildfire, and it was only a matter of time before he arrived at their doorstep. Jiraiya sat across from her again, this time with a map of the region spread before him. "His forces are consolidating near the borders. If he moves in from the west, we won't have time to regroup." Tsunade pinched the bridge of her nose, exhaling heavily. "How can we stop him, Jiraiya? How do you fight someone who's become this?" Jiraiya didn't answer. For all his wisdom and power, even he couldn't deny that Naruto had transcended anything they had ever known. "It's not just his power," Jiraiya murmured at last, looking up with a pained expression. "It's his hatred. Naruto's always been fueled by his emotions. When he loved this village, he would have died to protect it. Now that he hates us," he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Tsunade slammed her fist onto the desk, making the map jump. "We'll face him. No matter the cost." Jiraiya's face fell slightly, his voice softening. "And if it comes down to killing him?" Tsunade looked away, her throat tightening. She couldn't answer that. She couldn't let herself think about what it would mean to raise her hand against the boy who once believed in them with everything he had. As Konoha steeled itself for the inevitable, Sasuke stood on the outer wall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, bathing the land in shades of gold and crimson, as though nature itself foreshadowed the arrival of its golden conqueror. He felt it. A strange pull in the air, a weight pressing down on his chest. Naruto was coming. And deep down, Sasuke knew that this confrontation wouldn't just be a battle for the village, it would be a reckoning for his own sins. "I'm ready," Sasuke whispered to himself, though whether it was a lie or not, he didn't know. The winds carried his words into the distance as the shadows of night slowly swallowed the world whole. The wind whispered through the desolate valley as Naruto stood at the crest of a hill, his golden armor glinting faintly under the pale light of the moon. Below him, the ruins of yet another conquered village sprawled out like a broken relic of the past. Smoke curled from the remnants of charred buildings, and the cries of the defeated still echoed faintly in the distance. Yet for all the destruction he had wrought, Naruto's expression remained calm, his eyes cold and resolute. A figure approached from the shadows, their footsteps cautious yet purposeful. Naruto didn't turn, already sensing their presence. The newcomer was a tall man with a scar running down the length of his face, his weathered armor marking him as a former shinobi from the land of Earth. He knelt before Naruto, his head bowed low. "I pledge my loyalty to you, my lord," the man said, his voice gravelly but firm. Naruto glanced down at him, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. "You were once a proud soldier of the Subjugating," he said, his voice carrying an edge of quiet authority. "Why abandon them now?" The man looked up, his expression filled with a mixture of bitterness and resolve. "They abandoned us first. My family starved while the Subjugating hoarded resources for his inner circle. The shinobi system, it's broken. It's always been broken. You're the only one strong enough to change it?" Naruto studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Rise," he said simply. The man obeyed, his head held high now, his eyes reflecting a newfound purpose. He joined the growing ranks that had begun to gather behind Naruto, an eclectic mix of warriors, mercenaries, and deserters. Each carried their own story of betrayal, disillusionment, or desperation, but all of them had found something in Naruto that they had lacked in their previous lives: hope for a world reshaped by power, not tradition. As the days turned into weeks, Naruto's army grew larger. Word of his victories spread like wildfire across the elemental nations, drawing all manner of individuals to his side. Some came seeking refuge from oppressive leaders, others drawn by the promise of conquest. Yet what bound them together wasn't just Naruto's overwhelming strength, it was his vision. During one of his speeches, delivered to a newly formed gathering of recruits, Naruto stood atop a massive stone outcrop, his voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "The shinobi system has failed you," he declared, his tone filled with both fire and conviction. "It breeds war, corruption, and endless suffering. For too long, you've been pawns in the hands of those who see you as nothing more than tools for their ambition." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd watched him in rapt silence, their eyes reflecting both awe and fear. "But I am no Subjugating, no Mizukage, no Hokage," he continued, his voice rising. "I am something far greater. I do not seek to maintain this broken system. I seek to destroy it, to grind it to dust, and from its ashes, build something new. A world where the strong are not bound by the chains of tradition and weakness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder as his words resonated with them. Naruto raised a hand, and the murmurs ceased instantly. "Follow me," he said, his golden eyes blazing. "And I will give you the power to take what is rightfully yours. Together, we will remake this world in my image. Not for the leaders who abandoned you, but for ourselves. For our empire." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing across the valley. Naruto's charisma was undeniable, his words igniting a fire in the hearts of those who had once been broken by the system they now sought to destroy. Among the recruits was a young woman from the land of water, her face partially hidden by a mask. She approached Naruto that evening, her movements deliberate and calculated. "I've heard the rumors," she said, her voice cool and measured. "You're building an empire to overthrow the 5 great nations." Naruto turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And you're here to join, or to test me?" Her lips curved into a faint smile behind the mask. "To join, of course. The Mizukage has turned our village into a cesspool of fear and paranoia. Your vision intrigues me. But I need to see for myself if you're as strong as they say." Naruto stepped closer, the sheer weight of his presence enough to make her breath hitch. "Strength isn't given, it's earned," he said quietly. "If you're willing to fight for this cause, you'll find your answer soon enough." The woman nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mix of respect and anticipation. She joined the ranks without hesitation, quickly proving herself as a skilled fighter and a cunning strategist. It wasn't long before others like her began to emerge, disillusioned shinobi who had once served the great nations but now saw Naruto as the only force capable of bringing real change. They came from all corners of the elemental nations, rogue samurai from the land of iron, mercenaries from the wind country, even defectors from the hidden villages. Each one brought their unique skills and perspectives, and Naruto welcomed them all, provided they swore unwavering loyalty to his cause. Not everyone was easily convinced, however. One night, as Naruto's forces camped near the border of the Land of Lightning, a group of rogue shinobi from Kyomagaku approached under a flag of truce. Their leader, a towering man with dark skin and a massive battle axe slung over his shoulder, looked at Naruto with open skepticism. "You talk a big game," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "But words mean nothing without action. Prove to me that you're more than just another warlord playing God." Naruto regarded him coolly, then stepped forward without hesitation. "You doubt my power?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. The man grinned, gripping his axe tightly. "I doubt a lot of things. Let's see if you can change that." The battle that followed was brief but devastating. Naruto's speed and strength were unparalleled, his every movement calculated and precise. Within moments, the rogue shinobi was on his knees, his axe shattered and his pride in tatters. Naruto stood over him, his golden aura glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Do you understand now?" Naruto asked, his tone as cold as the night air. The man bowed his head, his voice filled with grudging respect. "I do. And I'll follow you, my lord." From that night on, Naruto's reputation grew not just as a conqueror, but as a leader who could command loyalty through sheer force of will. His empire began to take shape, with alliances forged in blood and fire. As the days passed, his forces moved with precision and purpose, striking at key outposts and supply lines, dismantling the foundations of the shinobi system piece by piece. The world watched in stunned silence as the Golden Warrior's influence spread like wildfire, his name whispered in both fear and reverence. And through it all, Naruto remained unwavering in his vision. He wasn't just building an army, he was creating a movement, one that would shatter the old world and forge a new one in its place. For the first time in his life, Naruto felt truly alive. Not as the outcast, the scapegoat, or the forgotten boy, but as a force of nature, unstoppable and undeniable. His empire was growing, and soon, the world would kneel before him. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange as Naruto's army gathered at the edge of the forest that bordered the Land of Fire. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Thousands of warriors, mercenaries, and defectors stood ready, their ranks disciplined and their eyes gleaming with a shared purpose. Naruto sat atop a golden throne carried by a massive chariot, his presence radiating authority and power. The gate of Babylon hovered faintly behind him, shimmering with otherworldly light as it pulsed with untold treasures waiting to be unleashed. Naruto's golden armor reflected the setting sun, and his eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the horizon where Konoha lay hidden. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of years of pain, rejection, and betrayal. His army was ready to strike, and the village that had wronged him would soon fall. In the distance, scouts returned with news. A wiry man with a mask covering half his face approached Naruto, bowing low before speaking. "The allied shinobi forces have mobilized, my lord," the scout reported. "They're setting up defensive positions along the western ridge, hoping to intercept us before we reach the gates." Naruto leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. "How many?" "An estimated 5,000, gathered from Konoha and its allies. They aim to block the main path to the village." A smirk tugged at Naruto's lips. "Let them come. Their resistance will be the first stone to crumble beneath my empire." He rose from his throne, his presence commanding absolute silence among his troops. "Prepare the forces," he ordered. "We'll meet their so-called army on the battlefield and show them what true power looks like." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Naruto's army began its march. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the ground trembling beneath the weight of thousands of boots. Scouts reported the location of the allied forces, and Naruto directed his army with precision, positioning his troops to strike at their weakest points. By the time they reached the western ridge, the moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light over the battlefield. The allied shinobi forces stood in tight formations, their banners fluttering in the cold night breeze. Among them, Naruto spotted familiar faces: Tsunade, standing tall in her Hokage robes, and Jiraiya, his expression grim. Other leaders from the allied nations were present, their determination clear despite the fear in their eyes. Naruto stepped forward, his golden armor gleaming under the moonlight. His voice rang out across the battlefield, cold and unyielding. "Konoha, you stand before me as you did years ago, full of arrogance and false righteousness. Today, I will show you the consequences of your betrayal." Tsunade stepped forward, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Naruto, this isn't who you are. We made mistakes, but it doesn't have to end this way. You can stop this." Naruto's laughter echoed across the battlefield, harsh and unforgiving. "You speak of mistakes as if they can be undone with words. Your mistakes cost me everything. And now, you will pay the price." With a wave of his hand, the gate of Babylon opened behind him, a dazzling array of weapons emerging from its depths. Swords, spears, and arrows of golden light hovered ominously, each one radiating immense power. The sight alone caused many of the allied shinobi to falter, their resolve shaken by the sheer magnitude of Naruto's power. Naruto raised his hand, and the weapons shot forward like a rain of destruction. The first wave of shinobi was obliterated instantly, their defenses crumbling under the assault. The ground shook as explosions ripped through the ranks of the allied forces, sending shock waves that knocked even the strongest warriors off their feet. The battle descended into chaos. Naruto's army surged forward, their morale bolstered by their leader's overwhelming display of strength. The allied forces fought back desperately, their jutsu lighting up the night sky as they tried to hold their ground. Jiraiya charged toward Naruto, his face set with grim determination. He unleashed a massive Rasengan, aiming directly for Naruto's chest. But before he could land the blow, Naruto summoned a shield from the gate of Babylon, deflecting the attack effortlessly. "Is this the best you have, Jiraiya?" Naruto taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You should have stayed in your village, hiding behind your lies and regrets." Jiraiya gritted his teeth and launched another attack, but Naruto was faster. He struck with the golden blade, slicing through Jiraiya's defenses and sending him sprawling to the ground. Tsunade watched in horror as her former student decimated their forces. She called for a retreat, but Naruto's army was relentless, cutting down anyone who tried to flee. Amid the chaos, Sasuke appeared, his Sharingan blazing as he locked eyes with Naruto. The two stood facing each other, the battlefield around them seeming to fade away. "Naruto," Sasuke said, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. You've gone too far. This isn't justice, it's vengeance. Naruto's expression darkened. And what would you know of justice, Sasuke? You, who played a part in my death. Don't speak to me of morality. Sasuke unsheathed his sword, his stance shifting into a fighting position. If you won't stop, then I'll have to stop you myself. The two clashed with ferocity, their battle sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Naruto's power was overwhelming, his mastery of the Gate of Babylon giving him an edge that even Sasuke's Sharingan couldn't match. But Sasuke fought with everything he had, determined to atone for his past mistakes. Their battle raged on, neither willing to yield. Naruto's strikes were precise and devastating, while Sasuke's movements were fluid and calculated. But it became clear that Sasuke was no match for Naruto's godlike power. With a final, devastating blow, Naruto disarmed Sasuke, his sword clattering to the ground. Naruto stood over him, his golden eyes cold and merciless. You were always the favored one, Naruto said, his voice filled with bitterness. But now, you'll see what it's like to be powerless. Before Naruto could deliver the finishing blow, Tsunade intervened, placing herself between him and Sasuke. Enough, Naruto, she pleaded. Konoha has fallen. You've won. Don't let this hatred consume you. Naruto lowered his weapon slightly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, the battlefield frozen in anticipation. Finally, Naruto spoke, his voice low and filled with finality. This is only the beginning. Konoha's fall is just the first step toward a new world. A world where I am king. He turned away, leaving Tsunade and Sasuke alive but broken. His army surged forward, claiming Konoha as their own. As Naruto stood atop the ruins of the Hokage monument, his golden armor shining against the night sky, he surveyed the destruction he had wrought. Konoha, the village that had once rejected him, now lay in ruins at his feet. And for the first time in his life, Naruto felt truly powerful. The cold winds whipped through the ruins of Konoha, sending the remnants of buildings swaying precariously. The streets were empty, the echoes of destruction still fresh in the air, hanging heavy like a lingering nightmare. Ashes drifted lazily in the wind, a grim reminder of the power Naruto had wielded to bring the once great village to its knees. As Naruto stood at the edge of the Hokage monument, his golden armor gleaming under the pale moonlight, he could feel the weight of his conquest settling deep within him. He had crushed Konoha, and with it, the symbol of everything that had betrayed him. But even with the village in ruins, one figure remained, Sasuke. Naruto had anticipated this moment, and yet, as he turned, the familiar presence of his former comrade brought a strange stillness to the air. Sasuke, his face marked with the wear of countless battles, stood in the shadow of the Hokage monument, his black cloak billowing in the wind. His eyes, still burning with the power of the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, locked onto Naruto with an intensity that could pierce even the darkness surrounding them. You're still here, Sasuke? Naruto said, his voice low and indifferent, but there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface, something close to uncertainty. I thought you'd run with the rest of them. I should have stopped you when I had the chance, Sasuke replied, his voice tinged with regret, though it was still firm. He stepped forward, the ground beneath him seemingly reacting to the weight of his resolve. This isn't you, Naruto. This is just vengeance. Naruto chuckled darkly, his golden eyes gleaming with disdain. Vengeance? You think this is just vengeance? What I did to Konoha is only the beginning. I'm building a world where I decide the rules. Where the weak won't suffer at the hands of people like you. He gripped the hilt of Ie, the divine weapon pulsing with energy as it appeared behind him, a symbol of his divine power. I am the king now, Sasuke. And I'll carve a new world from the ashes of this one. Sasuke's gaze hardened, his hands forming the familiar seals of his own power. He would not allow Naruto to destroy everything he had once fought for, everything he had once believed in. But more than that, he had a personal debt to settle, a debt born from betrayal and the broken trust between them. "I won't let you do this," Sasuke said, his voice steady, even though his mind was clouded with doubts. He had always been the one to push Naruto, to challenge him, but now that they stood on the precipice of the final battle, he wasn't sure if he could bring himself to destroy his friend. But there was no other choice. The world as it was, the shinobi system, it had to end. And if Naruto wouldn't stop, then Sasuke would do what he had to. With a flash of crimson light, Sasuke activated his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, the black flames of Amaterasu swirling around his eyes. The ground beneath him cracked and trembled as the power of the Sharingan surged through his body, guiding his every movement. In the next instant, the massive, ethereal form of the Susanoo manifested, towering over the battlefield like a god. Sasuke's face, resolute and determined, was reflected in the armor of the mighty apparition, its massive sword clutched in its hands. Naruto watched silently, his golden eyes glinting with amusement. He knew Sasuke would not back down. He had seen this battle unfold countless times in his mind, and yet, now that it was happening, he found himself feeling a strange sense of melancholy. The bond between them had always been complicated, full of resentment, rivalry, and unspoken understanding. They had both been driven by their desires, their pasts, but now their paths had diverged so far that it seemed impossible to ever find common ground again. "I've grown beyond this, Sasuke," Naruto said quietly, his voice a mixture of sadness and resolve. "This power, I can't be stopped now." With that, he lifted Ie, and the golden blade glowed brighter than ever before, radiating immense power. The air crackled as he swung the blade, and a massive shockwave erupted from the strike, tearing through the ground and sending dust and debris flying in all directions. The force was enough to make even Sasuke Susanoo stagger, but the ethereal warrior remained standing, its golden armor flickering with energy. "Your power isn't enough to stop me," Naruto said, his voice rising in confidence. "I am beyond everything you can understand. The gate of Babylon is mine to command. Ie is my will made real." Sasuke gritted his teeth, his hands tightening around the Susanoo's sword. "Then I'll just have to destroy you," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roaring winds. With a single, thunderous motion, Sasuke's Susanoo slashed forward, its sword clashing with Ie in a collision that sent a shockwave through the earth. The force of the blow was enough to rattle the very foundations of the village, but Naruto didn't flinch. He raised Ie again, summoning weapons from the gate of Babylon: spears, swords, and axes of divine origin, each one imbued with the full force of his power. The clash between their weapons rang out like a deafening bell, the sound echoing through the ruins of Konoha. Sasuke's Susanoo moved with grace and speed, each strike aimed at breaking Naruto's defenses. But Naruto was faster, stronger, his movements an extension of his godlike power. Each swing of Ie sent shockwaves that shattered the ground beneath them, tearing apart the battlefield. Sasuke's attacks grew more frantic as the battle wore on, his Susanoo taking damage from Naruto's relentless onslaught. The power behind each of Naruto's strikes was overwhelming, pushing Sasuke to the limit of his abilities. His Sharingan flickered, the weight of the battle starting to take its toll on him. Sweat beaded on his brow as he focused, trying to anticipate Naruto's next move, but every time he thought he had an opening, Naruto was already one step ahead. "I always hated you," Naruto spat, his voice full of venom. "You were always the favorite, the one everyone adored. While I was abandoned, cast aside. I was the one they hated, Sasuke. I was the one who had to fight for everything." His golden eyes burned with hatred as he swung Ie again, slicing through the air with devastating force. "And now, I will make them all see that I am the one who should have been in charge all along." Sasuke's eyes widened slightly, his breath catching as he realized the depth of Naruto's anger. He had always known that Naruto had suffered, but now he understood that suffering had consumed him entirely. Naruto was no longer the boy he had once fought alongside. He had become something else, something unstoppable. Sasuke narrowed his eyes, activating the full power of his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. His Susanoo roared to life, its energy flaring as he channeled everything he had into one final, desperate attack. "Then I'll stop you, Naruto," Sasuke declared, his voice a mixture of resolve and regret. "I won't let you destroy everything." With a final, mighty roar, Sasuke's Susanoo lunged forward, the sword raised high for a devastating strike. But Naruto's movements were too fast. With a flick of his wrist, Ie slashed through the air, its blade slicing cleanly through the Susanoo's defense, cutting through Sasuke's ethereal warrior as though it were nothing. The battlefield fell silent as Sasuke's Susanoo crumbled to the ground, its form dissipating into the ether. Sasuke was left standing alone, his body exhausted, his energy nearly depleted. He collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, unable to move. Naruto stood over him, his golden eyes cold and unforgiving. He raised Ie, preparing to strike the final blow, but something stopped him. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on Sasuke, who looked up at him, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I never wanted this," Sasuke whispered, his voice weak. Naruto stared at him, the weight of his hatred pulling at him, but beneath it all, something else stirred, something deeper, something buried beneath years of anger and betrayal. He looked down at Sasuke, his former comrade, and in that moment, he saw the boy he had once called a brother. "You're already punished, Sasuke," Naruto said softly, his voice colder than it had ever been. "The pain you've caused, the mistakes you've made, you will live with that for the rest of your life. That's more than enough punishment." With a final, disdainful glance, Naruto turned and walked away, leaving Sasuke to his broken thoughts. He didn't need to kill Sasuke. Sasuke had already destroyed himself. As the remnants of Konoha lay in ruins, Naruto looked out toward the horizon, his mind already turning toward the future. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There was a world to reshape, and he would be the one to reshape it. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the desolate landscape of Konoha. The once vibrant village, filled with laughter, energy, and the bustling of daily life, now lay in ruin. Its broken walls stood like the remnants of a forgotten dream, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and blood. Naruto stood at the village's gates, his golden armor gleaming in the fading light, his presence commanding the silence of the land. The weight of his power, honed over years of intense training and the unleashing of divine wrath, seemed to hang over Konoha like an oppressive storm cloud. He had already decimated the outer walls, sending shock waves through the entire village. No one was left untouched by his wrath. The once proud village, which had rejected him, had now been humbled, reduced to a shell of what it had once been. Yet Naruto's work was far from done. There was one final task to complete before he could move forward with his vision of a new world. Konoha's leadership had to be brought to its knees, and its people forced to confront the hypocrisy and betrayal that had defined them. Naruto stepped forward, his every footfall causing the earth beneath him to tremble. He did not need to shout to be heard, his voice would carry, as it always had, but now it was laced with an authority that could not be denied. His golden eyes, cold and unyielding, scanned the village, finding it in shambles. He did not feel satisfaction in the destruction. No, the destruction was merely a means to an end. The village had failed him, and this was the only way to make them understand. As he entered the heart of the village, he was met by the shattered remains of Konoha's once vibrant streets. There were no cries of protest, no resistance. Only the broken, defeated remnants of the villagers remained, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. The few who had not been slain in his previous assault trembled in his presence. At the center of the village, the Hokage monument stood, its faces once proud and towering, now cracked and marred by the chaos that had ensued. It was there that Naruto would make his final stand, where he would deliver judgment on those who had condemned him to a life of lowliness and rejection. It was there that the remaining leaders of Konoha, the ones who had betrayed him, would meet their reckoning. Naruto stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, as he surveyed the survivors. They had gathered in the square, the few remaining shinobi and civilians, all watching him with a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. Among them were Tsunade, Jiraiya, and the other key figures of Konoha's leadership, each of them standing before him, guilty in their own right for the role they had played in his suffering. Tsunade's eyes were filled with pain, and there was a deep sorrow in the way she held herself. She had always been a pillar of strength, but now she was no more than a broken woman, aware of the consequences of her actions. Jiraiya, standing beside her, had his head bowed in shame. His old eyes, once so filled with confidence, were clouded now, knowing that he had failed Naruto in every way imaginable. "Naruto," Tsunade said softly, her voice strained. "Please, we were wrong. We never meant for things to end like this." Jiraiya raised his head slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "Naruto, listen to me. We were all deceived. The village. Konoha didn't know what it was doing. We were blinded by our own fears and weaknesses. You were never meant to carry this burden alone. Forgive us, please." Naruto's gaze was unwavering. He had heard these words before, and they no longer carried the weight they once had. The guilt in their voices meant nothing to him now. Their betrayal, their neglect, had shaped him into the man he was today. They had abandoned him when he was most vulnerable, and now they begged for mercy, asking for forgiveness that they did not deserve. "Forgiveness," Naruto repeated, his voice cold and calculating. "After everything you've done to me? After all the pain you've caused me? You want me to forgive you? To forget the years of suffering you put me through?" His golden eyes flashed with contempt as he took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You thought I was weak, Tsunade. Jiraiya. All of you thought I was a tool, a pawn. Well, look at me now. I'm not your weapon anymore. I'm not your mistake." Tsunade's face twisted with anguish. "We never saw you as a weapon," she whispered, but her voice trembled. "We loved you, Naruto. You were always part of this village. You were never just a tool." Naruto scoffed. "Loved me?" He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "You loved the idea of me, Tsunade. You loved the version of me that didn't challenge your authority. You loved the idea of a hero, of a savior, but when I showed you who I really was, when I became the force that I was always meant to be, you turned your back on me." His words echoed through the square, each one a hammer striking against the fragile remnants of their beliefs. Tsunade lowered her head in shame, her hands trembling. She could not deny the truth in his words. "I gave everything for this village," Naruto continued, his voice rising with emotion. "I fought for you, Tsunade. I fought for Konoha. And what did I get in return? Rejection. Betrayal. You turned me away when I needed you the most. You threw me away like garbage." He raised his hand, and a wave of energy surged through the air, sending a gust of wind that scattered the remaining debris. "Now it's my turn to decide what happens next. I am the king of this world now, and you all will bend a knee." Tsunade and Jiraiya exchanged a glance, their faces full of sorrow and fear. They had failed him, and now they would have to face the consequences. But it was too late for apologies, too late for pleas for mercy. Naruto raised his hand, and with a single motion, the air grew thick with the weight of his authority. The villagers around him fell to their knees, unable to bear the crushing presence of his divine power. Even the strongest of the shinobi, those who had once stood as pillars of Konoha, could not withstand the force of his will. "You have all betrayed me," Naruto declared, his voice resonating with an unnatural power. "And now, you will all pay the price." His golden eyes flickered with a cold fire as he turned to face the key figures of Konoha. Tsunade, Jiraiya, and the others stood before him, powerless in the face of the godlike power he now wielded. With a single gesture, Naruto raised Ie high above his head, the divine weapon glowing with a blinding light. A sense of finality filled the air as he prepared to execute the judgment he had longed for. "You will be the first to know what true justice feels like," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering. The finality of his words was like a death sentence, and in that moment, Tsunade and Jiraiya understood the full extent of their failure. Their pleas fell on deaf ears as Naruto's golden eyes locked onto them, filled with an icy resolve. "I gave you everything, and you betrayed me," Naruto whispered, his voice filled with disdain. "But there is no place for weakness in this world anymore. There is no room for the kind of hypocrisy that defines you." His grip tightened around Ie, and with a single, swift motion, the blade descended, severing the fates of those who had failed him. Tsunade's final breath was one of disbelief, as she crumpled to the ground, her body still warm with the memories of the woman she once was. Jiraiya, the man who had once been a father figure, fell beside her, his expression one of sorrow and regret. The others, the council members and key figures of Konoha, met the same fate, each of them struck down in an instant. But not all were condemned. Naruto spared those who had shown him kindness, those who had recognized his worth when others had turned their backs. He spared those who had truly believed in him, who had seen him not as a tool or a weapon, but as a person, someone who deserved to live on his own terms. As the last of the key figures fell to the ground, Naruto stood alone amidst the wreckage. The air was thick with the weight of his actions, the silence broken only by the distant howls of the wind. He had enacted his judgment, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the past. "Let this be a warning," Naruto murmured to the wind, his voice carrying across the broken village. "No one will ever betray me again. This world is mine now. And I will reshape it in my image." He turned, his golden armor gleaming in the moonlight, and walked away from the fallen village. The world, with all its broken pieces, was his to command now. The judgment had been passed, and there was no turning back. Konoha had paid for its sins. The echoes of Naruto's footsteps resonated through the desolate halls of the former Hokage's office. Once a place of leadership, strategy, and diplomacy, it had now become the heart of something far darker, a kingdom forged by power and forged in pain. As he stood behind the polished desk, looking out over the decimated village of Konoha, he felt the weight of his own creation settling in. This was his new world, a kingdom that would be built on the ashes of betrayal and the foundation of absolute control. Naruto had not simply destroyed Konoha, he had destroyed the very fabric of the system that governed the elemental nations. The shinobi villages, once seen as the heart of their respective lands, no longer held any meaning. The alliances, the petty feuds, the endless cycle of war, all of it had to end. His empire would rise from the wreckage, and it would be built around one thing above all else, his absolute authority. The king's reign was not one of subtlety or negotiation. It was a reign of force, of overwhelming power, where loyalty to Naruto was the only law that mattered. He had seen the shinobi system for what it was, a self-serving, hypocritical structure that preyed on the weak and discarded those who did not fit into its mold. He had been that discarded pawn once, and now he would be the one to tear it all down. Naruto's empire stretched across the lands. What remained of the old villages, Konoha among them, had been swept into the fold of his divine rule. Where once there had been the great shinobi villages, there was now only one kingdom. Naruto had not left a single nation untouched by his might. He had absorbed them all, dissolving the once proud hidden villages into a vast network of territories under his control. Each land now paid tribute to him, and its people bowed before his unyielding rule. The shinobi system, as it had been known, was gone. Naruto's eyes burned with intensity as he looked across the landscape from the heights of the Hokage Tower, now transformed into a royal palace. The world below him was fractured, divided by borders of old alliances and conflicts, but to him, it was all part of his empire now. He could feel the pulse of the land, feel the power that surged from his every command. The gate of Babylon was no longer a mere weapon, it was the symbol of his rule, a constant reminder that his will could shape the world itself. His first decree had been simple: loyalty, unquestioning loyalty, would be the only thing that mattered in his kingdom. The shinobi who once valued their village above all else now understood that there was only one true loyalty that would keep them alive, that to Naruto. The idea of working for one's village, of fighting for ideals, was foreign in his world. In his new empire, only the pursuit of power, order, and control mattered. And so, the old system was abolished. No more would the shinobi work for their individual villages, fighting wars and skirmishes for resources or territory. No more would there be the endless cycle of betrayal and distrust that had kept the system broken. In its place was a monarchy, ruled by Naruto, where power came from the top down. The old village leaders had been swept away in his wrath, replaced by new officials who were completely loyal to him. There were no more Hokages, no more cages, only Naruto, the king of all. Naruto's reign was not one of mercy. Those who resisted his rise to power were crushed beneath his heel, their lands razed, their people enslaved. The memory of the shinobi system of its former glory was erased, replaced with the story of the new world order that Naruto had forged. Every action, every step, was calculated, ensuring that no one could rise against him, no one could challenge his dominance. His forces were vast, composed of those who had joined him willingly or those who had been forced into submission. Mercenaries, warriors from all corners of the elemental nations, and defectors from the old villages all pledged their loyalty to the new king. They knew what Naruto was capable of, and they understood that crossing him would mean certain death. Those who had once been allies in the world of shinobi now found themselves serving the man they had once feared. Peace was not won through diplomacy or compromise. It was enforced through sheer might. Naruto did not rely on the old methods of maintaining control: trade, treaties, negotiations. The people had seen what happened to those who challenged him. The villages that dared to resist his rule were swiftly and decisively crushed. His divine powers, his absolute control over reality itself, made rebellion a futile endeavor. He had the power to destroy whole nations with the wave of his hand, and every leader, every warrior who had once thought themselves powerful, now bent their knees to him. In his court, the warriors who surrounded him were the most loyal of his followers. They were the ones who had fought by his side in the battles that had cemented his rule. They were his generals, his advisors, and his closest confidants. They had seen the destructive power he wielded firsthand and had learned to respect and fear him in equal measure. They spoke to him with reverence, but always with an understanding that they were only allowed to do so because of their unwavering loyalty. Among them was a select few, the ones who had once been powerful shinobi, but who now owed their very lives to Naruto's rule. They had once been leaders in their own right. Now, they were nothing more than subjects to the king. Yet, under his rule, they were granted power and position that they had never dreamed of in their previous lives. They had seen what happened to those who disrespected Naruto's authority, and they knew that their lives would be forfeit if they failed to obey him. Naruto's empire, for all its fear and dominance, was also a place of order. The chaos that had once plagued the elemental nations was now under control. The petty wars, the assassinations, the conflicts that had defined the shinobi world for centuries, were gone. In their place was a new society, one built on the foundation of absolute order. The villagers who had once lived in fear of their own leaders now found themselves living in a society that, while ruled with an iron fist, offered them stability. Naruto knew that fear was a tool, and he wielded it well. His rule was absolute, and there was no place for dissent in his kingdom. Those who were not loyal to him were either crushed or turned into nothing more than slaves to his will. The citizens of the conquered villages were forced to work for the betterment of the empire, their lives dictated by the whims of the new king. But the people had no choice but to accept it. The old ways were gone, and a new era had dawned. But Naruto was not without his own inner struggles. Despite his outwardly unyielding presence, there were moments when he was forced to reflect on the path that had brought him here. He had been a pariah, a tool to be discarded by the very people who were now bowing to him. The faces of his old comrades, the ones who had betrayed him, still haunted him in moments of solitude. Tsunade's last plea, Jiraiya's tears, these images stayed with him, a reminder of the past he could never fully escape. Yet he pushed these thoughts away, focusing on the future. The world he had inherited was one of his own making, and he would not let it crumble under the weight of doubt. Konoha had been destroyed, its leaders dead, and with their passing, so too had passed the world that had created them. In their place was Naruto's kingdom, a kingdom where power was the ultimate law. His forces continued to grow. Warriors from all over the elemental nations sought to join his ranks, eager to serve under the God King who had reshaped the world. Villages that had once been the strongest forces in the land now fell in line, accepting their place beneath his rule. Naruto's dominance was absolute, and the world bowed to him not because of kindness, but because there was no other choice. The peace that Naruto had promised had come, but it was a peace that was maintained through fear, not love. It was a peace that demanded unwavering loyalty, and anyone who dared to defy him would learn that there was no escape from his wrath. His reign would continue until the end of time, a rule unchallenged, unbreakable. And as Naruto sat in the throne that had once belonged to the Hokage, a smirk crossed his face. His work was not yet done, but his empire was complete. There was nothing left to stop him. The world was his to command, and he would bend it to his will. No longer would he be a pawn. Now, he was the king, and his kingdom would endure forever. The world had been reshaped. What had once been a chaotic, fractured land filled with endless war was now quiet, still under Naruto's rule. The shinobi villages were no more, replaced by a vast, unified empire under his iron-fisted monarchy. The land was orderly, and there was no more conflict, no more betrayal, at least, not on the surface. Naruto had established peace, but it was a peace born from domination, fear, and unyielding control. And yet, the uneasy stillness that had settled over the elemental nations was not to last forever. Far above him, in realms that were untouched by mortal hands, higher beings watched with growing concern. They had long observed the balance of the world, where each power, each being, had a place. It had been their duty to maintain equilibrium, to ensure that no one would disrupt the delicate forces that governed life and death. But Naruto, the mortal who had ascended beyond his own kind, now stood as a king above all. He had bent the laws of nature to his will, wielding divine power as though it were his birthright, and in doing so, he had threatened the very balance they had sworn to protect. The first to come were the gods of ancient legends, beings of unimaginable power, each of them tasked with keeping the natural order in place. They saw Naruto as a threat, not just to the world of men, but to the cosmic laws that had ruled for eons. The balance of life and death, the cycles of creation and destruction, all of it could be torn apart if this mortal, this king, continued to rule unchecked. They gathered, plotting their intervention, sending emissaries to challenge Naruto, to bring him to heel. But what they did not understand was that he was no longer just a man. He had transcended humanity. He had become something greater, a being that bent the fabric of reality itself, a force of destruction and creation, a god among men. The first of the divine to challenge him was a being that claimed dominion over the heavens themselves. A god of light, radiant and blinding, who descended upon Naruto's kingdom with an entourage of celestial warriors. The sky seemed to crack and shudder as this divine presence manifested, a crackling energy filling the air as the god's form hovered above the earth, his voice booming like thunder. You who claim to be a king, a ruler of men, know this: your existence is an affront to the balance of the world, the god thundered, his voice filled with authority and anger. You have taken what was not yours. The world was never meant to bow to one such as you. Naruto stood before the god, unmoved by the celestial display of power. His golden armor gleamed under the oppressive light, and his eyes burned with the fire of a ruler unchallenged. He was not intimidated, not even by this divine being, for he had long known that power was a language understood by all, and his was greater. You speak of balance, of laws that govern the world, Naruto said, his voice cutting through the god's thunderous words. But all I see is a broken system. A system that threw me aside, that betrayed me, that allowed the weak to reign. Balance means nothing to me. The celestial warriors, standing at the god's side, prepared for battle. They brandished weapons that shimmered with divine energy, their power palpable in the air. But Naruto did not flinch. He raised a hand, summoning the gate of Babylon. The legendary gate opened wide, revealing an endless array of divine weapons, each one brimming with power far beyond mortal comprehension. Balance. Naruto repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. I have created my own balance. One where I am the center. One where power is the only truth. The first attack came swift and without mercy. The celestial warriors charged, unleashing torrents of light, energy, and divine fury. They sought to crush him beneath the weight of their combined power, to destroy the blasphemous mortal who dared defy the heavens. But Naruto's response was immediate, his own power erupting like a storm. Yea, the weapon of ultimate destruction, appeared in his hand, its power crackling with energy that tore at the fabric of reality. With a single motion, Naruto unleashed a blast of force so immense that it ripped through the ranks of the celestial warriors, sending them flying. The god of light, undeterred, summoned a shield of pure energy, attempting to block the attack. But even his divine barrier faltered under the onslaught. Naruto's golden eyes locked with the god's, and for the first time in centuries, the celestial being felt doubt. The mortal before him was no longer just a mortal. He was a force of nature, a being whose strength was not bound by the limitations of his flesh. In that moment, the god of light understood that this was not a battle for power, it was a battle for control over the very laws of the world. Naruto stepped forward, his footfalls heavy and resolute, his gaze unwavering. You think you can stop me? He asked coldly, his voice laced with the weight of a king who had never known defeat. You think you can challenge the god who has already conquered this world? With another wave of his hand, Naruto summoned the full force of the Gate of Babylon, unleashing an arsenal of divine weapons. Swords, spears, and arrows rained down upon the god of light and his celestial warriors, their power undeniable. Each strike hit with precision, carving through divine defenses and shaking the heavens themselves. The celestial god, his form faltering under the onslaught, struggled to maintain his presence. This is not the end, mortal, he declared, his voice now tinged with desperation. You have only touched the surface of what exists beyond your comprehension. But Naruto's response was swift and brutal. He raised his hand once more, focusing all of his power into a single, devastating blow. Ie surged with energy, and with a final, earth-shattering strike, the god of light was consumed by the sheer force of Naruto's attack. The celestial god screamed in agony as his form disintegrated, reduced to nothing more than cosmic dust. His warriors, too, were obliterated in an instant, their bodies torn asunder by the might of Naruto's divine wrath. Silence followed, a silence that was felt across the land, as if the very earth itself held its breath. Naruto stood victorious, his body unscathed, his power undiminished. He had not just defeated a god, he had shattered the notion of what a god could be. And then, just as quickly as the battle had begun, a new presence made itself known. A being of shadow and flame, draped in darkness, appeared before him. The air seemed to warp around the figure, and the temperature dropped as the very essence of despair and death radiated from him. This new adversary was a god of destruction, an ancient being whose purpose was to ensure that the cycle of life and death remained intact. He had come to challenge Naruto not out of personal malice, but out of duty. Your actions have upset the balance, the god of destruction said, his voice like a whisper of doom. You cannot escape the consequences. The universe will right itself, even if it means your demise. Naruto's gaze hardened as he stared down his new adversary. Balance. Again with the balance, he muttered, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. I've heard enough of this nonsense. The god of destruction raised his hand, summoning waves of energy so powerful that they tore through the landscape, reshaping the very fabric of reality. Space itself seemed to distort, folding upon itself as the god sought to break Naruto's hold on the world. But Naruto was unyielding. He summoned his powers again, this time calling upon the full might of Ie, the sword that could cleave through anything. The two forces collided in an explosion of power, sending shock waves across the world. The land trembled beneath the clash of their energies, but Naruto stood firm, his resolve unshaken. You think you can undo what I've done? Naruto said, his voice calm, almost mocking. You think you can challenge me with your empty threats? I am beyond your reach. With that, Naruto unleashed the full force of his might, his divine energy tearing through the god of destruction's defenses. The celestial being screamed as his form unraveled, the power of Naruto's attack obliterating him, turning him into nothing but ash. In the aftermath of the battle, Naruto stood alone, the victor once again. His divine energy surged through him, stronger than ever. The higher beings that had once ruled over the balance of the world had been vanquished, their claims of control shattered by his power. The balance of the world had been disrupted, but not in the way they had feared. For Naruto had proven something greater, that the laws of the universe could be rewritten by the will of a single being. He was not just a king. He was a force of nature, a god among men, and no power, divine or mortal, would ever again challenge his rule. The winds of time swept through the land, gentle yet relentless, as the world slowly came to terms with the reign of the king. Years had passed since the great upheaval, the battles that had reshaped the very essence of existence, and now, in the heart of the unified empire, Naruto Uzumaki, once an outcast, a demon in the eyes of many, sat upon a golden throne, his rule undisputed, his legacy eternal. His empire stood as a testament to his strength and will, a land no longer fractured by war, no longer ruled by the chaos of endless conflict. The villages of the past had dissolved into history, replaced by a single, unified kingdom. The shinobi, once warriors in the service of their respective lands, had become the enforcers of his will, soldiers who served under the banner of a singular king. There was peace, a peace born from his iron fist, a peace that ran deep, where no one dared challenge the authority of the ruler who had rewritten the laws of the world. Naruto's empire thrived in ways no one could have imagined. The land was prosperous, its people united under his vision of strength and order. No longer would there be petty squabbles between villages, no more alliances forged out of convenience only to be shattered by betrayal. Naruto had created a world where loyalty was absolute, and peace, however imperfect, reigned in every corner. Yet, in the quiet moments when the noise of his empire faded, when he found himself alone in the silence of his palace, Naruto often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had not always been a king. Once, he had been the child of the village, the boy who had carried the weight of the nine-tails chakra within him, a symbol of fear and hatred for those around him. He had been cast aside, ignored, and then betrayed. The very people he had sought to protect, to call family, had turned their backs on him, and he had watched in horror as his own parents, his own blood had failed him. It was in those darkest hours, when everything he had known had crumbled, that he had found his true strength. Pain had been his constant companion, and it was that pain, that betrayal, which had shaped him into the ruler he was now. There were no regrets, not anymore. The path he had walked had been paved with suffering, but it had led him to greatness. It had led him to a destiny that no one else had been capable of seeing. The golden throne he sat upon now was not just a symbol of power, but a reminder of everything he had endured. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of battles fought and won, of gods slain, and enemies crushed beneath his heel. He had not only conquered the elemental nations but had reshaped the very world itself. The system that had once oppressed him, that had tried to break him, was no more. And in its place stood an empire built on his vision of strength, where only those who were worthy could stand at his side. Naruto's eyes gazed out the window of his grand palace, overlooking the sprawling capital that had grown under his reign. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the land. It was a sight he had seen countless times, but today, it felt different. Today, the weight of the years seemed to bear down on him more than usual. He was not just the king, he was the symbol of a new world, a new era. And yet, in the quiet of his thoughts, he couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it, if the sacrifice had truly led to the world he had always dreamed of. A soft knock on the door interrupted his reverie. A trusted advisor entered, bowing respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty, the council awaits your presence," the advisor said. Naruto stood, his movements deliberate, his posture that of a man who had long since become comfortable in his power. He nodded, acknowledging the call to duty. There was still work to be done, still decisions to be made for the future of his empire. As he left the room, he walked through the halls of his palace, his steps echoing in the silence. He passed by portraits of those who had served him, generals, advisors, warriors, all of them loyal to the king who had unified the nations under his banner. There was no longer any room for doubt in his mind. He had done what was necessary. In the council chambers, the highest-ranking officials of his empire were gathered, discussing matters of state. Tsunade and Jiraiya were no longer among them. Their pleas for forgiveness had fallen on deaf ears all those years ago, and they had vanished from the public eye, living in quiet exile. The faces before Naruto were new, born from the ashes of the old world, men and women who had pledged their loyalty to him and him alone. "Your Majesty," one of the counselors greeted, bowing deeply. "We have made great strides in the rebuilding efforts. The people are thriving, and the military is stronger than ever. There are no more signs of unrest. The empire is stable." Naruto nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was rare for him to show such emotions, but he allowed it this time. His heart, though hardened by years of war and betrayal, could not completely deny the satisfaction that came with hearing such reports. It was a confirmation that his vision, his empire, was real. The work had not been in vain. "Good," Naruto said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Continue the efforts. I want no stone left unturned. This empire will endure for centuries, and we will make sure it is stronger than it ever was before." As the council continued their discussions, Naruto's thoughts drifted again, this time to the future. What would become of the world after him? Would the peace he had fought so hard for remain, or would it dissolve into chaos once more? He had no illusions about the fragility of power, but he also knew that his reign had left an indelible mark on the world. The world had seen the truth: power was the only true currency. And those who wielded it would forever be the ones who shaped the course of history. Naruto's empire was not just a kingdom, it was a living, breathing entity, built upon the foundation of his strength. He had made it clear that he was the ultimate authority, and no one would dare challenge him again. The old world, with its petty wars and betrayals, was gone. In its place stood a new world, one ruled by the king who had risen from the ashes of destruction. As the years continued to pass, Naruto's rule became legend. His name was spoken in hushed tones across the land, not as the boy who had once been the village's outcast, but as the king who had united the elemental nations under his reign. His presence was a constant reminder of the power he had attained, and his legacy, like the golden throne he sat upon, would endure for generations. But even as he sat atop the throne, ruling over a peaceful, prosperous land, Naruto could not fully escape the remnants of the past. The loneliness, the isolation, the pain of betrayal, these things lingered in the depths of his heart, no matter how much he tried to bury them beneath the weight of his empire. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted, but at what cost? He had become the ruler of all, a god among men, but he had also sacrificed everything to get there. His humanity had been stripped away, piece by piece, until only the king remained. His friends, his family, the bonds that had once given him purpose, those were distant memories now, memories that had faded into the past. Naruto had become something more than human, but in doing so, he had lost much of what made him who he was. Yet, despite all that, despite the emptiness that sometimes crept into his soul, Naruto could not help but feel a sense of pride. He had created a legacy that would stand the test of time. His name would be remembered long after he was gone. The world would know that he had been the one to bring order to the chaos, the one who had united the nations, the one who had rewritten the course of history. As the final days of his reign approached, as the sun set on his empire, Naruto allowed himself one final moment of reflection. He stood at the balcony of his palace, looking out over the land that had once been divided, now unified under his rule. The people he had once fought for, the people who had once feared him, now saw him as their king, their protector, their god. And in that moment, Naruto realized something. The pain, the betrayal, the suffering, it had all been worth it. He had become the ruler of a new world, one where peace reigned, and his legacy would live on forever. The wind blew softly through his hair as he turned away from the balcony and walked back into the heart of his palace. He was the king, and his reign would endure for eternity. The world had seen his power, had witnessed his rise, and it would remember his name for as long as time itself endured. Naruto Uzumaki, the king of the elemental nations, sat upon his throne, and for the first time in his life, he knew that his destiny was fulfilled.